Well, you know, there's kind of mainstream anthropology, mainstream world history, and then there's fringe. Yeah. You know, okay? Or what's it also? Alternative history is what it's called. There's alternative history. And the alternative history spans, you know, it has a spectrum going from the science fiction type to more esoteric type. So I won't call it fringe history. Let's call it alternative history, which is fascinating, but which of course is rejected by academia. On the science fiction type, of course, again, I refer to 2001: A Space Odyssey, that brilliant movie, which tries to give an answer to this question of how did this happen to begin with? And Kubrick's answer was, you know, the obelisk, right? This mysterious black thing which some alien presence had deposited on the Earth, and which the proto-humans in contact with experienced a mutation of consciousness. Okay, that's, you know, it's coherent. I found it very exciting. Whether it's true or not, who knows, right? If you look at Graham Hancock's book, really enjoyed this book. Graham Hancock, Fingerprints of the Gods. Fingerprints of the Gods. Any of you read that book? Okay, it's a fun book. In it, he summarizes all kinds of things, theories from alternative history, including the theory, some of the elements of alternative history are archaeological anomalies. And the big leader here was Charles Fort, who actually started a journal called the Fortean Times, which is still in publication. Check out the Fortean Times. But he was the founder of what's now called alternative archaeology. I think it's called alternative archaeology. And he pointed to some interesting seeming anomalies, like iron nails embedded in metamorphic rock that is many millions of years old. Or very precise seeming astronomical instruments that were found buried in the Mediterranean that date back several thousand years before the historical period. All kinds of very strange things that standard archaeology just can't figure out. Or the seeming, the coherent argument made by Anthony West, and I can't remember this other guy's name now, about the, first of all, the apparent age of the Sphinx in Egypt. Very convincing argument to my mind. If you look at the weathering of the rock at the base of the Sphinx and so on, a good case can be made that it's much, much older than what standard archaeology says it is. Not only that, but if you look at the alignment of the three great pyramids relative to the Nile and so on, it maps perfectly onto the constellation of Orion. However, as it would have appeared from that spot 12,000 years ago. So right before the end of the last ice age. Not 5,000 years ago when it's supposed to have been built. So what was happening 12,000 years ago before the last ice age? Well, so Hancock goes through all of this, and in the process he also goes to these ruins in Peru and just all over, bringing it all together to point to the idea, including this theory by a friend of Einstein's, a renegade geologist who had this theory of crustal shift. So he links together crustal shift with the idea of periodic global catastrophe that seems to be timed to the precession of the equinox, or the great year. The last time that it would have happened was 12,000 years ago. And so we're sort of halfway through that cycle. We're at the midpoint of that cycle, which is going to coincide in 2012. And anyway, it goes on and on. It's a very coherent account of all sorts of strange things. in this version, of course, instead of the, well, it's sort of similar to Kubrick. You have, the question is, well, where did it all begin? And if these were around prior to what standard history and archaeology tells us, much earlier, where did it come from? Well, Atlantis. And this is where you can get into Steiner and Blavatsky and the whole esoteric tradition and so on. Except in this tradition of Hancock and alternative archaeology, Atlantis is really the first settlement of these alien species. So then it goes off into science fiction again. So again, you can either do the esoteric route and think of higher beings, subtle beings. And this is the direction that Steiner and Sri Aurobindo might go in and others. Or you can go in a more sort of materialistic science fiction bent in the direction of Kubrick and many other people who want to imagine sort of literal beings from a different star system who would have seeded our planet long ago and are at the source of hominization and also at the source of the great civilizations and will be our anticipated saviors.
Since our new students
yes.
don't know that you gave a course with Daniel Pinchbeck, maybe you could tell them a little bit about where you each came out in that course.
Well, yeah, it was, no, there was no conclusion because it's so complex. Daniel, in his fascinating book, 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl, he goes through many of these ideas, including Steiner, a very faithful rendering of Steiner.
Very faithful.
No, he doesn't believe that, well, yeah, I mean, he does believe, at least he did, I don't know what he believes now, because his thought is always changing, but he did
2 years ago.
Yeah, 2 years ago, yeah. Believe that we are in an end time and that the world as we have known it is collapsing. We're, as Joanna Macy says too, we're involved, we're witnessing, participating in the great unraveling of industrial growth civilization, but we're also in the time of the great turning. This is Joanna Macy's terms. Simultaneous great unraveling and great turning. So Pinchbeck also believes this, and that we are on the threshold of this great turning, of this passage into a new age, and that there is some kind of mutation underway, not necessarily an immediately observable genetic mutation, but a mutation of consciousness that will not only involve possibilities of a kind of higher intuitive knowing and experience on the part of wide portions of the world population, but will also be accompanied by a potentially quite sudden restructuring of social organization, forms of social, political, economic, and cultural organization. So he does believe that's possible. And he's more interested lately in actually trying to help that happen by encouraging a sort of network-based grassroots groundswell transformation, right? That is consciousness-driven, that is populist-driven, that is socially network facilitated, and so on. So that's sort of where he's going. Yeah. If we look at just the historical period, or even, let's say, the first axial age, Rick talked about the axial age, didn't he? Mm-hmm. Okay, so that period centered around around 500 BCE, but actually quite a bit bigger, where you have the simultaneous emergence of the figures that will provide the scriptural basis for all of the world's, for the great world religions, so-called, Buddhism, Taoism, Hinduism, at least certain form of Hinduism, Jewish prophets, Jainism, Greek philosophy, and so on. So that's the first axial age, axial because so much revolves around it afterwards in terms of world religions. Amazing synchronistic emergence all over the planet, except none of them knew that it was happening anywhere else. Right? This is the character of the pre-planetary period. Everybody's in mutual isolation, more or less, even though there is sporadic trade and so on going on. First axial period, around 500 BCE. Now we hopefully are entering into a second axial period. The idea of a second axial period was first proposed apparently by Thomas Berry, and then taken up by Ewart Cousins. And I think it's a great idea. A second axial age. Unlike the first axial age, this one has the possibility of not only emerging spontaneously over the whole planet, but of being conscious of the fact that there are multiple centers of emergence, and in fact is defining itself through the conscious and conscientious facilitation of dialogue and communication among and between these multiple centers of emergence. This is the difference between the first and the second axial. In the first axial period, you have all these centers popping up and giving birth to different species of the aspiration toward a universal spirituality, right? A universal ethic of the good and the true and the beautiful, various incarnations of wisdom, ideals of wisdom and compassion and love and so on. Amazingly beautiful, but none of them really knowing anything about the others, and their followers tending to think that they're the only path. Right? So there's a kind of inbuilt exclusivity despite the aspiration towards universality. That's the first axial age. Second axial age is one in which we realize the impossibility, or not, the unsustainability, let's say, not the impossibility, the unsustainability of pushing for exclusivity. And yes, exclusivity. Doesn't mean that an individual can't have their own path and believe that that's the path for them. But that individual path is increasingly walked in the awareness of a planetary path, of the path of the Earth community, whose destiny we all share, right? There is no, this is the fundamental insight of the Great Turning and of the second axial age, is that each individual path is the destiny of each individual, and their path is tied up with the destiny of the entire Earth community. Right? We have a shared life and death destiny as members of the Earth community, as participants in this critical phase of the planetary era. This is the sort of fundamental insight and value of, we might call, the Great Turning, the Integral Age, the planetary era, the second axial period, different words for the same aspiration and mutation that is emerging. Right? Or these different gropings, as Teilhard might say, that are happening now, different words coming out, trying to name something that we're all feeling and experiencing, at least those of us who are privileged enough, those of us who don't have to worry about clean water and being hungry all the time or being bombed, right? Which is not a very big portion of the planet, admittedly. So we have a great privilege and great responsibility. But there are people like us all over the planet who are aware of this impulse, carrying it, gestating it, birthing it.